Dr. of Theater or something.
Good.
Oh,
Okay.
Hard.
So we're going to start then with a few elements of housekeeping. We're still a little bit thwarted in this because I still don't have login credentials from the university. I'm hoping to have that by the end of the week. So, okay. I think there might be a few other steps, but Dr. Janssen is still posting things. The homeworks, the way we're doing this, the homeworks for chapters 1 through 5 are going to be due on the 9th of October, and the homeworks for 6 through 9 due the 6th of November. So I'll repeat that in a second. It'll also be in writing in an updated version of the syllabus within a few days. Homeworks 1 through 5 due on the 9th of October, and homework 6 through 9 due on the 6th of November. So that way you've got some time to manage the preparation for that. So tonight I want to give you an introduction to the economic way of thinking. And good evening. So in many ways, the economic way of thinking is something that we could spend an entire course on, and that's sort of what we're going to do. But I want to give you more of a specific application-based economic way of thinking. So if you were taking a microeconomic theory class, and some of you are shuddering maybe at the memory of your price theory class, we would go into a lot of greater depth. The idea here is to give you some basic tools and concepts that we can then use and apply for analysis of business decisions, etc. So as with everything else, and this is one of the major themes for the evening, there's going to be a trade-off. Now the trade-off that I've chosen for this class is I'm going to give up some mathematical rigor in exchange for getting more insight and more application. So we're not going to be terribly mathematically rigorous in this class. That's a trade-off that we've got to make based on the budget constraint that we have, which is time. So with that in mind, I want to start with an analogy of the way I think about economics. So the way I think about economics is a balance between the poetry of economics and the science of economics. So there's a science to economics. It's a science that's developed over the past 200 some odd years. You can use mathematical tools and applications, and there's a place for that. But there's also a certain poetry to economics in being able to understand the world and apply the tools of economics to the world in a way that is not necessarily mathematically rigorous, but gives us an insight, nevertheless, into the world. And we see that there are cases where we can use mathematical applications and it's helpful. And there are other cases, to quote an economist, I think it was the economist F.A. Hayek who mentioned this, I would rather be vaguely right than precisely wrong. So there are limitations to mathematics, as we're going to see. So we're going to do a little bit of graphing tonight, but mostly what I'm trying to get is this big picture of how we can apply the tools of economics and how economists think. Because economists, in some ways, economic thinking is just common sense. And in other ways, economic thinking is a completely different way of approaching things. So I'll periodically share personal stories. About 5 years ago, I gave a $100 check to my then girlfriend as a birthday present. She wasn't happy with it. And she said that I couldn't be giving her money, that I had to put thought into the gift, etc. And I told the story at a dinner party that night, and there was a philosophy professor and his economist wife. And the economist's wife says to me, well, of course you gave her cash. It minimized the deadweight loss. So we were speaking a language that we both understood. The deadweight loss means coming from the inefficiency that I did not have perfect knowledge of what my girlfriend might want, so I gave her cash, and that was my signal, hey, you use your perfect knowledge about yourself, take this money, go buy yourself something that you'll enjoy, maybe travel to a conference. She was in law school at the time. And the economist got that immediately. And economist to economist, it made perfect sense that we were minimizing the deadweight loss, minimizing the inefficiency, but to a non-economist, that seemed vaguely insulting. So one of the things that we're going to look at tonight is that there are some things that are common sense and obvious. I'm going to be up here, I'm going to be writing things, I'm going to be talking about things. And you might say, well, yeah, that's obvious. And then other things maybe not so obvious, because economists have a different way of thinking about the world. And tonight is really the introduction of that way of thinking about the world. So if anybody online cannot hear me, please ping me with a text message. I'm just going to wait a few seconds. So it seemed to be okay, but I want to make sure. Okay, I'll check back in periodically. So what I want to do for tonight's lecture is I want to start with a definition of economics. And I know all of you have had economics at some point, but I want to define it and talk about why it's important. Then after that, I'm going to talk about 6 basic concepts. And you're thinking to yourself, wow, I had to spend an entire semester learning economics and you're going to boil it down to 6 basic concepts? Yeah, that's what I'm going to do. This reminds me of a group called the Condensed Shakespeare Company. Anybody heard those? It's a comedy group that takes a Shakespeare play and reduces it to 10 minutes. And then they take a Shakespeare play and they reduce it to 1 minute, including the costume changes. So that's a little bit what I'm doing tonight, reducing economics to a few concepts. Then we're going to have a unit tonight on utility analysis, which is basically utility curves and budget constraints. I'm going to give you the basics of that. And then we're going to close by looking at the assumptions of economics, why it's important to have assumptions in economics, and what the limitations and powers are of those assumptions. So with that, let's get started. What is economics? I always like this because there's a fun definition which is really technical, so I'm going to word it out for you, and then I'm going to slow it down. So economics is the study of the principles governing the allocation of scarce resources among competing wants, when the objective is maximizing the attainment of those wants. Whoa, okay, whoa. Yeah. That's a lot of words right there. So I'm going to break it down. And if we break it down, so economics is about allocation. It's about scarce resources. And it's about competing wants. What does that mean? The simplest way to think about it is there's an infinite number of things that you could possibly be doing with your resources, but the resources themselves are finite. So the inputs or the resources are finite, and the uses for them are infinite. If I wanted to waste your time, or if you wanted to waste your time right now, you could pull out a piece of paper and write down 500 things that you could be doing instead of being here in class tonight. That would be a waste of time. But the point is to show that you only have 24 hours in a day. And most of you are probably thinking to yourself, oh yes, I know that only too well, because most of you have day jobs. And you've got a day job, you're taking classes, you've got to find time for homework, you've got to find time for family, some of you, time for commuting, time for taking care of yourself, time for cooking, maybe even time for sleep. But that's an example right there. You have a finite amount of time in your day, 24 hours, and there's nothing you can do about it. It's really funny to watch undergraduates every year, because about week 14 or 15 of the semester, undergraduates think that they have the magical superpower of bending time. And they think that somehow they're going to be able to squeeze 26 hours into a 24-hour day. You can't do it. We've all tried it. So economics, again, is about the allocation of scarce resources among competing wants. That's another way of saying, okay, we have a finite number of resources, whether it's time or whether it's money, creative energy, mental energy. It could be other kinds of resources. Anything that you could use, there's a limited amount of those. And there's a potentially unlimited amount of things that you could do with them. So you're going to have to make a decision about how you're going to use those things. And there really are 2 ways of approaching this. One way of approaching it is you're just kind of going to bounce from decision to decision and let events govern things for you until you realize that it's 2 o'clock in the morning and you've got to be up at 6 o'clock for a meeting. Or what you can do instead is you make the decision instead of letting the events make the decisions for you. And you say, okay, here's my list of priorities. Here's what's most important to me. I am going to make an active decision about how I am going to allocate my scarce resources among competing wants. And really, all of economics is really simple. It's the study of what people do when they're faced with a constraint of limited resources. 3-year-olds are typically experts at economics. All that economists are doing in a certain sense, okay, it can get complicated, you can get complicated vocabulary, you can get complicated graphs, but fundamentally, all that economists are doing is coming up with a set of ways to analyze the ways in which people make choices and allocate those scarce resources among competing wants. Because we are faced with the harsh reality of not having enough resources to do all the things that we want. That's where economics comes in. My undergraduate teacher, and then who was later my graduate teacher in economics, used to have a question on his exams: does economics exist in heaven? And I remember being stumped by that question. And fundamentally, what does it come down to? Is there scarcity? So just for fun, I would ask my students that. And some of the creative responses were, some students might say, well, in heaven, all resources are infinite. And therefore, there's no such thing as economics, because economics exists only if you have scarcity. And then one other student answered, well, there's a set number of hearts. So you might have to get into a fight with another angel over who gets a heart, in which case there is economics. But the bottom line is, economics exists because of scarcity. People have made choices for thousands of years of how to fill their days, how to use their resources. All economics does is study that. So it's a pretty basic, straightforward thing. We're studying what people are already doing, but it also allows us to make better decisions. And I found, in fact, that one of the best time management classes I ever took was not a time management class. It was an economics class. And it was simply second semester graduate microeconomics. And that's where I realized, well, wait a minute. In order to be a better time manager and to do more things, I'm simply going to apply the basic lesson of economics. I have scarce time, and I have a long list of priorities. Instead of bouncing around, it's the end of the week, and I haven't done a lot of things that are important for me, I'm going to set out my goals at the beginning of the week. Radical? Maybe. Maybe not. But my application was simply, I was going to say, here are the things that matter to me, and I'm going to make a choice at the beginning of the week to do the things that I want to do that are most important to me, and leave the other ones aside. And in many ways, when I look at what it means to be a manager, when I look at what it means to be a CEO, a lot of that comes to prioritizing. You cannot do everything. You simply can't. So you're going to have to make the decision of what you want to do. And I remember one time management guide, and I haven't applied this theory yet, but one time management guide that said, divide everything into 3 piles. The A pile is the absolute priorities. B is stuff that would be nice, and C is stuff you'd like to get to eventually. Throw out all the C stuff. Just get rid of it. That's one way of looking at things. So one of the takeaways for this class could be constantly thinking in the back of your mind, I have a scarce resource, how do I apply it? So a simpler definition of economics, instead of that, the allocation of the scarce resources among competing wants, when the goal is to maximize the attainment of those wants, blah, blah, blah. You can think of it, economics, simply as scarcity analysis. So how do we analyze and how do we make choices in a world where there's limited resources and potentially infinite number of things? Or opportunity cost analysis. So let me erase this. I'm going to write the word opportunity cost. Opportunity cost is what flows from scarcity. Opportunity cost is what flows from scarcity. Whiteboard is blurry. Okay. See what I can do about that. I'm going to try to focus to see if we can get the whiteboard. Actually, let's see. What if we... Does that help with contrast? A little bit, yeah. What about this one? No. No. Okay. Whiteboard is blurry. I didn't even know that existed anymore.
Yeah, I had it for 17 years.
So we're pausing for a moment to see if we can get the board in better view.
Sorry.
No.
I cannot zoom in versus out right now.
Is the Zoom broken? It worked earlier.
Yeah.
And,
Do it on camera.
okay. So I think this is the best we can do. I'll make sure and be clear. I apologize. Black pen and write a little bit larger. I will do that. Thank you. And so, as I mentioned before, I don't have login credentials quite yet. For those of you who haven't listened to the last lecture who weren't here last week, I'm a new faculty member here on staff, and things were somewhat precipitated as I was hired over the summer. I'm hoping to have my own login by later this week. In the meantime, I've been getting documents to Dr. Janssen, who's been posting them online for me. I will have my lecture notes online by the end of, hopefully by the end of the week, so that you can use those. So
I haven't seen any documents on. You guys? No, the only thing I saw was the assignment one.
okay, well, I'll check with him about that.
I was just saying, maybe I'm missing it.
I'll check with him. So that's the best we can do?
Yeah.
Okay. Gotcha. So thank you for that. If anything is unclear, obviously for the people in the classroom, you can see that I've written it down. People online, just ping me with a message and I'll re-explain the concept. So opportunity cost is what flows from scarcity. Every choice that you make to do something is also a choice not to do something else. So if you're in class tonight, you've made the choice not to be out with your friends, or not to be watching a movie, or not to be exercising. You have made a choice to be here because you decided that was the best use of your time. And the opportunity cost is simply the value of the next best thing you could be doing with your time. The value of the next best thing that you could be doing with your time. So everything, every choice that you make in life, in business, in long-term planning, in short-term planning, everything is going to have an opportunity cost because we live in a scarce world. So one of your fundamental jobs as manager of yourself, and as manager of a unit, and as manager of a company, is going to be to keep in mind the opportunity cost of what you're doing. And this is one of the places where economists think of the world. Oh, Vitaly will handle that. This is one of the places where economists think of the world slightly differently than accountants do, or that the rest of the world does. I'm going to give you 2 examples of that, and we're going to come back to this in about 3 weeks when we talk about supply. So we have next. So we're going to try to work on some technical difficulties here, and we'll be right with you. Do you want to take a look at it? Or?
Yeah. So you're saying the speakers are not working? Yeah. Let me pause.
Which was the case of?
It was
Okay.
on Nike using sweatshops, kind of like child labor.
We're back. Thank you. So apparently there still is a bigger problem with the speakers. The IT guy was working on that. We're going to continue as we go, and I'm going to come back to the text message screen periodically to see if you've got any questions. I'll need feedback from you at some point, so hopefully I'll have, again, I'll have an email within a few days, but after about 2 or 3 lectures, I want to ask the folks who are following online what is most beneficial to you. So I'll have notes posted for you, whether it's a PowerPoint or whether it's a Word document. We'll have the video posted also, and then the question is going to be, how can we best integrate you, and what's the best way for you to get the material? So I'll be asking you for feedback on that, because since it's a hybrid class, obviously I've got 3 different audiences: the people here, those who are following live, and those who check in later as they can. So I'll be asking you for feedback on that as we try to fine-tune things, and hopefully we had a marginal improvement. So this is the next thing we're going to talk about. We've got a marginal improvement over last week because now the main camera works, which is good, and hopefully by next week we'll have the speakers going. So I mentioned opportunity cost. This is a tricky one because in some instances, opportunity cost is really, really obvious. You all know that you can't do 2 things at the same time, or at least not be in 2 places at the same time. But opportunity cost can get a little bit tricky when you start to think about applications in the real world, and people often forget some of those things. So One example of that, which we'll talk about in 3 lectures from now, is the difference between economic profit and accounting profit. I'm sure you've covered this at some point, but I want to review this. Accounting profit is simply the difference between total revenue and total cost. You're done. So how much money are you bringing in, how much are you spending? The economist looks at that and says, you also need to think about your opportunity costs. So if you own a building, for example, and you're using it for your operations and you're making $50,000 a year, but you could be renting the building out for $100,000 a year, your opportunity cost is too high to justify your activities. And you've got to think in those terms. We'll talk about this with examples from international trade next lecture and how opportunity costs can show which countries should participate in what activity. We'll talk about it 2 lectures from now or 3 lectures from now when we look at the supply side of things and why a business needs to look at opportunity costs. But this is also something that's important for me. I remember when I got my first teaching job, I hired a high school kid to mow my lawn. And it seems like a pretty obvious thing to do. I was paying him, I don't know, maybe $7, $8 an hour. He was mowing my lawn and I could focus on other things. And I still had that guilt feeling that, you know, I'm an American, I'm healthy, I should be out there sweating and mowing my own lawn. And every time he mowed my lawn, I would feel a little bit guilty, even though I'm trading economics. Until one day, a Saturday afternoon, I'm sitting down and I'm preparing a guest lecture I was going to give, and I was going to be paid $1,000 plus expenses to give the guest lecture, and I hear the lawnmower. And I realized, oh, opportunity cost. There it is. That's why I'm not mowing my own lawn. That's why I'm focusing on doing economics and letting him do it, paying somebody to do it, because I can still come out ahead, very much ahead, focusing on some other activity and not mowing my own lawn. The second concept that I want to talk about briefly tonight is the concept of sunk cost, and it's related. So in the popular mindset, if you get a subscription to a newspaper, you should read it because you got a subscription and you paid for it. If you got a gym membership, you should go to the gym because you paid for it. An economist is going to tell you that decision is gone. It's finished. What you need to do now is look at your time and decide, what is the opportunity cost of my time? Even if I bought a newspaper subscription for the year, if my opportunity cost of reading it is too high, then I shouldn't read the newspaper. Now, when it comes time to renew the subscription, I can look at the fact that I never read the paper. But it's always important to look at your time now and your decision now. The third concept, so scarcity is the first concept, opportunity cost, the second concept, and the third concept I want to talk about tonight is marginal thinking. These are the 6 concepts. So the first concept is scarcity. The second concept is opportunity cost. And the third concept is marginal thinking. So as you can see the outline, or as you cannot see it for online, the outline that I have here is my disciplinary mechanism. If we get lost in a conversation later, if I go off on a story, I'll always come back to my outline. Third concept is marginal thinking. So economists like to think at the margin. And at the margin simply means the next unit. Now I've got a little gimmick that I use for this for my undergraduate classes. I'll come to class with a box of chocolates. And when I'm starting my lecture, I will place a chocolate down in front of an undergraduate who smiles and eats the chocolate because chocolate is good. Then about 30 seconds or a minute later, I'll place another piece of chocolate in front of the same student, and I'll continue talking. The student's still smiling and eats it. By the time I've placed 6 or 7 pieces of chocolate, the student is a lot less excited. Why? Well, because we have different levels, different units, different margins. What's that, sir? That's the law of diminishing marginal returns, exactly. So the satisfaction from the first piece of chocolate was huge. Yay! It's the end of the evening. I haven't had much to eat since lunch. I get a piece of chocolate that's great. So going from the 0th to the first piece of chocolate makes me really happy. But going from the 7th to the 8th piece of chocolate is going to give me a lot less satisfaction, because a piece of chocolate is not equal to a piece of chocolate. It depends how many you've already had. It depends on what margin you're operating. So as Tiara pointed out, that is the law of diminishing returns. In that case, in the beginning, we have a high marginal return. Each piece of chocolate gives you a big satisfaction. But as you keep going, you're going to get lower and lower satisfaction. Here's another life hack, so to speak. Think about that in your own studying. So you've probably all reached the point where it's midnight and you're trying to study and you've read the same paragraph 4 times and your eyes keep blurring over. Well, you have reached not just diminishing marginal returns, but you have reached negative marginal returns. For every unit of labor that you put in, so every minute of work that you put in trying to read, you're actually going to waste your time and probably forget what you were reading because you're so tired at that point. So that's a good excuse, that's a good opportunity to say, listen, I am going to keep working until I hit diminishing marginal returns. Then I'm going to close my book and I'm going to go do something else because you want to be productive. So this is a case where economics can help you in your individual life.
You said it's negative.
That's, well, you can have 3 cases: positive, diminishing, and negative. So I'll give you an example. You start studying. You're still thinking about your stupid roommate who didn't do the dishes. You're still thinking about the bills. You're having trouble concentrating. You're warming up mentally. Then you're going to have, for a little while, you're going to have increasing marginal returns because you're getting more and more focused. You're going to get more out of every minute of studying. Then eventually you're going to plateau and you're going to start getting tired. Then you're going to get diminishing marginal returns. So for every unit of labor that you're putting in, every unit of time that you're spending reading, you're still getting a positive benefit, but you're getting less than you were. Then eventually you're so tired that you start forgetting what you were doing. You start making mistakes. You're going to have to fix them in the morning. That's negative marginal returns. So marginal thinking is an important one because we have to think that a unit of whatever it is, a unit of time, a unit of work, a unit of chocolate, a beer. There's a t-shirt I saw once, and this is nice thing, you're all graduate students, so I can say this. I can't say it in front of undergraduates. I saw a t-shirt once that said, "It only takes 1 beer to get me drunk." I don't know if it's the 7th one or the 8th one. Example of marginal thinking, so that's economics in action. But another place that marginal thinking comes in is in the distinction between the marginal benefit and the marginal cost. So this is basically saying, if I put in 1 more hour of work, what is the benefit that I expect to gain from that 1 hour? That's the marginal benefit. And what is the cost that I expect? And that's the hours spent that you're working. So you could be doing something else. And it doesn't make sense to do something if the marginal cost is higher than the marginal benefit. So you're not going to spend $12 trying to get a $10 return. That wouldn't make sense. And so that is why also people stop searching at some point. So when you're going to buy a new car, what do you typically do when you're going to buy a new car?
Research.
You're going to research. Now, when you buy that car, are you satisfied that you've researched everything about the car and that you've looked at every single car in the country? No, because that wouldn't make sense. You keep researching your car as long as the marginal benefit exceeds the marginal cost. So you keep researching, because if you walk into a dealership and say, I want that car, without doing any research, you're making a bad decision. You don't know if the car's any good, you don't know if the model's any good, you didn't look up the VIN number and Carfax, et cetera, et cetera. You could also spend an entire year going through the website of every single dealership in the country, to use a really stupid example. But in that case, you know that the benefit from 1 more hour of research is so infinitely small, but the cost is really high. So you've got to determine, and this is why you turn in a term paper. Every term paper that you've turned in, I guarantee you could have worked more on it. Even if it was an A paper, it could have been slightly better. Why did you stop working on it? What's the concept? At that point, the marginal cost exceeded the marginal benefit. So it's important to think about that in your own terms, in your everyday life. It's a very simple concept. So I'm going to pause for a second and read part of a commencement speech that some of you may have heard at some point.
Within the last 6 months?
No,
Steve Jobs.
I don't think so. No, this is by Admiral McRaven. And Admiral McRaven is obviously a U.S. Navy admiral who was in charge of SEAL training. And he writes, I'm going to quote from a part of it and then ask you how you feel about this, and I'll tell you how I'm a little bit crazy. He quotes, Every morning in basic SEAL training, my instructors would show up in my barracks room, and the first thing they would inspect was your bed. If you did it right, the corners would be square, the covers pulled tight. This may sound familiar to some of you. The pillows centered just under the headboard, and the extra blanket folded neatly at the foot of the rack that's Navy talk for bed. It was a simple task, mundane at best. But every morning we were required to make our bed to perfection. If you make your bed every morning, you will have accomplished the first task of the day. It will give you a small sense of pride, and it will encourage you to do another task and another and another. By the end of the day, that one task completed will have turned into many tasks completed. Making your bed will also reinforce the fact that little things in life matter. If you can't do the little things right, you will never do the big things right. What do you think about that? Thoughts? Does it make sense?
Yeah.
Yes?
Details.
Details? Okay. Do all of you make your bed every morning?
Yes.
Okay.
That's because I'm anal.
Okay.
I'm anal.
Man,
I can't really,
Don't use that word.
I can't.
So we have several people here who don't make their beds, and if somebody who chimed in here that you don't, somebody says, I would rather sleep. So what does that tell us about opportunity cost? If you'd rather sleep, you've made the decision that it's more valuable to sleep than to make your bed.
Do they have like a 500-piece bed that takes more than like
Well, that's another thing. Throw pillows. When we get me started.
It takes you less than 5
Somebody
seconds
says,
on your feet.
would rather sleep. Anybody else think that that's not a good idea?
To what?
To make your bed every morning?
Well, I know you're asking this from an economic standpoint,
Yeah.
but there's also a philosophical standpoint of if you start the day making healthy, positive decisions, and it like snowball effects down.
Okay. So 2 arguments. One says here, I save time because I don't have to turn it back at night. And the counter argument we have is the snowball effect of making good decisions and other good decisions. So I want you to think about that, because there's no answer for everybody. It's going to be different for everybody. Why? Because everybody's got a different opportunity cost. So you can take a guess as to what I did earlier today when I was putting final touches on this lecture. I made my bed and I timed myself just to see how long it would take. And this is actual economic experimentation, right? It took me just shy of 2 minutes. Well, okay, so maybe I'm not very efficient at it. Maybe I could be better at it. But it was about 1 minute and 50 seconds because I was trying actually to be pretty good at it. So I calculated 2 minutes. And I thought to myself, what is the opportunity cost of 2 minutes? Nothing, basically, right? But what if I take it on a weekly basis? Yeah, so I could be doing something else. So the way I calculated is I thought, what if, let's say for the sake of argument, I don't make my bed every day, and I just make it once a week when I clean the sheets, for the sake of argument. That's 12 minutes a week that I save from not making my bed. And if I multiply that by 50 weeks, we're talking, what, 600 minutes? Does that make sense? Yeah. Divided by 60, that's 10 hours a year that I could be doing something else other than making my bed.
That's a little impractical in the sense that, are you comparing that 10 hours a year to very similar incremental situations where you only apply 2 minutes of your time a day?
Well, that's exactly what I was thinking. So in my analysis, what if I save 2 minutes a day from not making my bed, and 2 minutes a day from having 4 shirts? So I do laundry every 4 days. I got 4 shirts. I got 2 pairs of khakis. I don't think in the morning. I just grab the next clean shirt. What if I save 2 minutes by not having to think about that? What if I save an extra 2 minutes by not having throw pillows on my bed? What if I save an extra 2 minutes here and there, and suddenly we're talking 40, 60, 100 hours a year? So I've made the calculation in my life that it's not worth it for me because the marginal benefit of doing so exceeds the marginal cost. Now, Chiara just made the point a few moments ago. What about the philosophical side of things? Well, I would counter-argue, maybe the first thing that I do in the morning is make the healthy decision to apply marginal thinking and opportunity cost analysis and decide specifically that I'm not going to. On the other hand, maybe doing so gives you discipline that you wouldn't otherwise have. So what am I trying what's the point I'm trying to make is that each and every one of you is going to have a different set of opportunity costs. No two people in this room have the same opportunity cost because we all have different opportunities, we all have different costs, we all have different things that we could be doing. Likewise, different people are going to draw different levels of marginal benefit versus marginal cost from certain things. Maybe you get immense satisfaction from making your bed and knowing that you've done a small thing right and it's going to set you on the right path for the day. In that case, the marginal benefit is huge and the marginal cost is small. So a lot of times in this class, I'm going to be frustrating, and intentionally so, because I'm not going to give you an answer for something. I'm just going to give you a framework for thinking about it and keeping in mind that different people are going to have different opportunity costs, and different people are going to have different marginal analysis and different benefits that they're going to derive from different things, because we all have different sets of preferences and we all have different constraints in our life. So I would imagine, for example, if you're in boot camp, there's a pretty high marginal cost of not making your bed in the morning, right? And the marginal benefit is pretty high. Marginal benefit is high, so you're not going to get in trouble, and the cost is high if you don't do it, so that would make perfect sense to do it. So all of that is going to depend a lot on circumstances. And I'll have some other questions for you about marginal thinking as we go along. So I'm going to check the board here to see if we've got any questions. Yeah, I like this one. 2 minutes, you could study economics.
Teacher's pet.
Yeah. And then there's also the consideration. I'm a bachelor, and I had a dog who was blind, so he didn't care if I made my bed. But if it's 2 minutes in the morning as an investment to have harmony in your marriage, probably worth it. Point number 4, incentives matter. There's a time and place for dreaming. Remember I said at the beginning of the class, the poetry of economics and the science of economics? I'm reminded when I speak of economics of the first human attempts at flight, which were disastrous. There are documentaries on this. If you ever go to the Air and Space Museum, people would observe birds and decide that they're going to be like a bird and strap feathers onto their arms and jump from a building. It's flat. So what do you need in order to have human flight? You need 2 things. You need the laws of physics and a healthy respect for them, otherwise you're going to crash. And you also need a dream. You need the vision to make it happen. But you need the vision constrained by the laws of reality, the laws of physics. And economics in many ways is the same thing. Economics can't tell you what you should and should not do. That's going to be the next point. Economics can only tell you what the likely consequences are and how to think about things. So one of the things that makes economics different from the normal way of thinking, as we call it, is that there's no wishful thinking in economics. You can wish away a problem employee, as we're going to talk about later. Or you could say, well, I'm going to post a notice on the bulletin board saying, please clean up your dishes in the lunchroom. But an economist is going to tell you that wishful thinking it's not going to solve the problem. You need to look at the incentive structure that people face. And this is going to be part of your job as managers. Different people are going to respond to different incentives. Some people respond really well to commands. Some people respond really well. Professors, I would not want to be a dean, and I have immense respect for the deans, because professors are like cats. Try herding cats. I mean, professors are the kind of person where basically you say, okay, we're hiring you for your initiative. Go off and do stuff. Run student programs, teach your classes, write papers, and go to conferences. Go ahead and do it. And then you try to get a professor to come to a meeting for an hour. Oh boy, professors are going to complain. I don't want to do that. It's such an infringement on my time. It's an hour. But this is the way professors think, and they need to be motivated in a different way. Some people would hate the job of being a professor, because being a professor is kind of, not quite, but it's kind of, okay, so you just got your degree. Here is the kind of stuff that we want you to do. And in 7 years, we're going to give you a job for life, or we're going to fire you, or we're not really going to give you much feedback along the way to go. And some people love that. Some people thrive on that. I love it. I would hate to get up in the morning and work on somebody else's research and work on somebody else's projects. So we'll talk about this a little bit later in the class, what motivates people. I could be making 2 or 3 times more money if I were to go work for a bank, for example. But I don't want to get up in the morning and go to an office and work on somebody else's projects and somebody else's research. I want to work on my own projects on my own time. So a lot of my best working hours are after 9 o'clock at night. So I'll just work from 9 to 2 o'clock in the morning. Then I'll sleep till 10. Doesn't matter as long as I get the job done. Some people would hate that because some people want to be told what to do, when to do it, and then leave the office at 5 o'clock and go home and enjoy the rest of your evening. I never really leave the office. So it's a weekend, I'm driving along, I'm thinking about my latest research paper. It's the weekend, I might be running with friends, I might be at a, I don't know, I'm not going to tell you the details of what I do, because some of the things I do are embarrassing. Board games, video games, we all do those. And I might be thinking of something and think, well, how can I present that idea differently to my students? How can I do it better? So there are no edges to my life. And part of the challenge of being a professor is imposing the edges. But keep in mind also incentives matter. What's going to be the reward structure as we look at that? So,
But then do you ever truly have free time? Like,
well, I have to make it for myself. So I have huge amounts of free time if I choose to take it. So I might stop working for 3 days, and then for a week I'll work 12-hour days. But it takes a while to do that. I have a tendency to overwork because I'm my own boss. So
that also means that your brain really does not shut off even when you sleep because you're constantly.
Yeah, that's part of the problem. That's why I play video games occasionally, because that's one way to turn off the brain. Running's a pretty good one also, but it's also thinking time. So.
Yeah.
So you know, again, this is types of things for you to think about, how you're going to motivate. How are you going to get the best out of your employees? One of the ways is to look at what is their incentive and how do they respond. So I've had places where I practically had to check in with, not quite officially with the clock, but if I wasn't there at 9 o'clock, it was frowned upon, and I accumulated something like 8.33 days of vacation per month, 8.33 hours of vacation per month. And then I've worked at other places where they said, well, we don't have a vacation policy. Check with your supervisor. Take as much time as you need off as long as you're getting the job done. And different people are going to respond differently to those things. So part of being a manager is trying to figure out how people respond to incentive structures. How are you going to get the best out of them? Because different people are going to respond differently. The other thing is, and this is often frustrating, economics takes preferences as subjective. So what do I mean by that? You can have an argument with somebody and say, okay, I think you're stupid for voting for such and such political candidate, or I think that idea of yours is bad. But as an economist, you don't do that. You simply say your preferences are your preferences. And I'm going to analyze your behavior based on whatever your preferences are. I'm not going to say whether they're right or wrong. So later in this class, we might have political discussions. But we're not going to have discussions about the politics. We're going to have discussions about the effects of what a political decision could be. So for example, if President Trump suspends NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, suspends it by executive order next week, and you are the economic advisor to a CEO, what would your advice be? The point is not to say whether it's a good or bad idea to suspend NAFTA. The point is not to say whether or not he's a good president. The point is, okay, this is the reality. What does my CEO need to know? What are going to be the consequences for our customers? What are going to be the consequences for our shareholders? What are going to be the consequences for our providers, for our workers, et cetera? So we're occasionally, and I'm going to tie that in with the next point a little bit, we're going to look at, take preferences as given as we analyze them. This is still, okay, so number 1, scarcity. Number 2, opportunity cost. Number 3, marginal thinking. Number 4, incentives matter. So I want to tell you a few stories of how incentives backfired, and then I want to ask you if you have any examples you want to contribute. So you saw in the textbook there are 2 examples. One of them was a company that wanted to increase the productivity of the typing pool. This was back in the days before word processing. So they set up a device on a machine to count the number of strokes on the typewriter and paid the secretaries a bonus if they typed. Well, they found that one of the secretaries over lunch was sitting and banging the same key repeatedly. And that, again, was counterproductive. There are stories, the textbook has the stories of Soviet taxis that were not working. This is, again, what was the incentive structure? So The government set up a scheme to pay them by the mile. So the taxi drivers, instead of picking up customers, would zoom around the highways as fast as possible. Again, backfired. There are also stories of Soviet managers being rewarded for the number of nails that they made. So they would make teeny tiny little nails that were completely useless, but they made a lot of them. So the next year, the central planner said, okay, we're going to reward you based on the weight. So allegedly they would make one massive big nail. But there are other stories like this of incentives that that might not work too well. One is during the British colonial rule in India, there was a problem with cobra snakes. So the British authorities set up a bounty, and anybody who brought in a dead cobra was given a reward. Well, pretty soon people figured out, well, wait a minute, I'm going to get rewarded according to the number of cobras I bring in. So there were cobra farms that were set up to raise and breed cobras. So they would have massive quantities of cobras, kill them, and bring them in to get the reward. Counterproductive, because the goal of the operation was to reduce the number of cobras. So they ended the program, and what did the cobra farmers do at that point? Let all the cobras loose. So that didn't work out. So something to keep in mind, and we'll talk about this a little bit also later. The typical example of this is, how do you get a CEO to advance the shareholders' benefit? How do you get a CEO to advance the value of the company? So one of the ideas is, you've all heard this, give the CEO stock options instead of just salary, because if the CEO is drawing a salary, the CEO gets paid regardless of how well the company does, so the CEO is not going to have an incentive to work as hard. But what could be one of the drawbacks of having a CEO compensated with shares rather than compensated with a salary?
No, if they have a personal profit, like,
Long term?
Oh.
Go ahead. Personal profit?
yeah, they'll make sure that it does, because they can make money to benefit. from
So they can get a benefit, but what about the long term versus short term? Where were you going with that?
Usually incentives are something they're timely, and
Yeah.
stock options are usually, they're timely, but like long-term timely. So you're not gonna reap benefits for a while unless you sell them off.
Well, you got to be careful exactly about the timing, because what if
Oh, yeah.
what if the CEO gets paid in stock this year as opposed to over 5 years? And we'll talk about this more later as we go on.
It doesn't think about the actions he's gonna expect long-term.
Yep. So you have a lot of cases where CEOs are going to cut research and development. They're going to do everything they can to drive up the value of the stock now, even if it's bad for the company. So you got to take care of the timing. So the idea in all of this, and we'll go into it in greater depth as we analyze this, you got to think about the consequences, long-term versus short-term. You got to think about the incentive structure that you're setting up. So any examples that you can think of, yes, of a bad incentive structure?
Well, this one wasn't necessarily a business, but it was a book example of the midpoint, which was so ingenious, and I wish it happened in my life. They basically, the MIG company, I don't know if you guys read it, was like one of those, I don't always read those small little examples in the book, but sometimes I do and worth it. But the MIG company was trying to promote these Indian coins, and they were selling them for the exact value of the Indian coins, and people were using their credit cards to buy like $10,000 of the coins, get 10,000 miles, go take the coins to the bank, pay off the credit card before the interest rate hit. Why wasn't I alive?
Well,
Why?
scams like that typically don't last, but people always have
But
things
there are
like
people
that.
that do benefit.
Yep. But it typically doesn't last. So there's stories, for example, of people who will rent a car and drive it around the parking lot and then return it, and they still get the points and they still get the miles, but they don't have to pay for the expense. Can you think of any other stories where either in your personal life or in something that you've read of an incentive, of something, of a program that was set up to try to change the incentive of people, but that backfired? Unintended consequence. What can you think of? Yes.
When I used to be working for Nostrum as a salon shoes manager, so salon is like, you know, you talking Christian Dior, you know, like high whatever. And so I put in place like incentives, instead of just selling one shoe, if you sell at least two, including the cleansing product, like multiple sales, then you'll get whatever. So people had their friends come in and purchase, and then they say it's weekly because they used to get paid every week. So then next week they'll bring it back, but they're already benefited from that. So like their check was nice, they were number one, it was nice, they got paid for it, but they returned it, and the return is done upstairs in customer service. And then later it comes back to us, and then by the time we get it, It's time called right back.
Mhm.
So
So,
that's one example I have.
we'll pause. I'm going to ask you a question about that for a second. For those who are listening online, were you able to hear that comment, or should I repeat it? I'll look here.
Yes.
You couldn't really hear. Okay, so I'll repeat the story. What's your name, please?
Judith.
Judith was working at Nordstrom in shoe sales, and to give an incentive to the staff to sell more shoes, there was a bonus program if additional shoes were sold and additional product was sold. So the salespeople would get their friends to come in and buy the shoes. The salespeople would get the bonus, and then the next week, the friends would return the shoes to the store and get the money back, but the salespeople had got the benefit. So the bottom line is, it didn't work because the company wasn't really selling more shoes, but people were getting the benefit. So how could that have been designed differently? Something that either Judith or anybody else, how could that have been designed differently to try to get the positive outcome?
And I was just thinking about a situation where it was the complete opposite
Mm-hmm.
at the university. Certain business and budget managers were made aware of an incentive that if the employees exceeded expectations, they would get $700 in merit. And those that met expectations got $400. Unbeknownst to the people that all along had been getting exceeds expectations, all of a sudden you couldn't get it anymore. Now they say they want you to have your employees go above and beyond. However, that wasn't the case, because when it got time to give the money, supervisors, managers found a way to knock it down so that you wouldn't get the maximum amount.
That's unethical.
Yeah, I think that,
It's unethical, but it's not unethical because they don't feel like it's unethical because they feel like they're saving money, even though it's not their money. I know.
with her example, you have to put boundaries and limits. So like I used to work commission, selling like high-end jewelry, bullets, and diamonds and stuff, and they would not pay us our commission check until past return date. So that way the money, like, so, 90 days return date, you'll get your commission check in 91 days. And then also you have to look at like the book says,
No,
the
I
ethical
mean,
value
like I said,
decision-making of individuals, whether you're asking them to make that decision.
So
But,
go
can I
ahead.
just add? So.
And then I'll summarize the books.
In my case, okay, I was the manager, but I had supervisors. So the supervisors also were in on it because the department was good. Like, salespeople were selling multiple at once, not just one shoe. So they were bringing more than one boxes. Like if you come for one pair of shoes, they'll bring different colors and different styles. Or maybe you may want to look at that. And first I would go with them, lots and lots. So they were also in on it because the supervisor also got something out of it.
Mm-hmm.
So until, it like, we didn't think of that until later. So what we did was, the salesperson that sold it, so when it gets returned, so the information it's on the receipt, we would deduct. Like, it will go against you, like the return. So if it won't affect you maybe the week that you sold it, but this week. So let's say you sold $50 and you have $150 returned from last week. So people stopped doing it and they started being more,
So a lot of this incentive design. So the examples that were given in the case of the shoes and another sales case was to have another stipulation whereby you wouldn't get the bonus until after the return date had passed, or individual employees would face a consequence because that was good incentive design. Individual employees would face the consequence of having a shoe return in the form of docked pay. So we'll look at details. We'll have we'll have an entire unit on how to incentivize people and how to do so with pay versus other things. But the general concept right now is to think about the incentives and how people are going to try to game the system and work the system. So I'm going to take a second here to look at, so somebody said the commission's taken back. Okay. Another example that I've got here from online is scheduling for physicians. If physicians are paid per patient, the patients are scheduled closer together, which means a less effective and comprehensive visit and increased waiting time. I've heard of situations even, but this is a slightly different story, where the insurance companies are trying to cut back on costs, and doctors will say, if you have an appointment, you're allowed to ask one question. And then you've got to schedule another appointment for another question.
But it's an additional copay.
So it's an additional copay, et cetera. Yeah. And the doctors are trying to set up that incentive structure. Incentives, wait to consider until the return period is over. Good, good, good. So thanks to those online for contributing those comments. So that's the kind of thing that, well, I'm hoping to warp your minds. This is where, as an economist, I always look at these kinds of things, and I always think, what is the incentive being set up? And what is likely to be the response that people are going to have this behavior? Because you can't just say, okay, we're going to solve this by telling people that they're great. Well, that doesn't really work. I had a boss once, I'm not going to tell you what university it was, but it was kind of funny because when he had the introductory meeting with faculty, he said, it's a privilege to be here because we're one of the top 100 business schools in the country. Well, 2 weeks later, he got up and gave a speech. He said, it's a privilege to be here because we're one of the top 80 business schools in the country. Well, nothing's really changed. By the end of the month, it seemed like we were one of the top 40 best business schools in the country. We were joking that pretty soon we were going to be number one if he said it. And you can't just set up incentives by telling people things. You actually have to look at what their incentive structure is. Good. So we're going to move on to point number 5. And point number 5 is normative versus positive. So all this may seem basic to those of you who have had economics recently, but it's a good reminder, normative versus positive. Normative refers to what should be. Think of a norm of behavior. Positive means what is. Positive analysis, what is. So as an example, a normative statement is parents should read to their children. It's saying, okay, I'm going to make an assertion about the way I'd like to see the world. This is the way it should be done. A positive statement is, if parents read to their children, children will tend to do better at school. Economics is a positive science. Now, even in this class, we're occasionally going to talk about ethics. We're going to talk about normative behavior occasionally. Economics informs normative behavior, but economics cannot tell you what your goal should be. Economics is only about means-ends relationships. That means economics can tell you if you do something, this is what's likely going to happen, but it cannot tell you what you should do. Let me illustrate with an example from physics. So, I have in my hand my car keys. I'm going to hold the car keys over Daryl's head. What does physics tell me will happen if I let go of the keys? Law of gravity. 32 feet per second squared is going to be the acceleration of the keys towards his head. 9.8 meters per second squared for those of you who like the metric system. It'll stop on his head. Physics tells me if A, then B. If you let go of the keys, they will accelerate at 32 feet per second squared. What does physics tell me about whether I should or should not drop keys on a swing set?
You shouldn't.
Nothing. Physics doesn't tell me.
Oh.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. Philosophy is, the law is, I've committed a tort if I've done that, the basic norms of politeness. There are all sorts of things that tell me, but physics is not one of them. Physics cannot tell me if I should or should not drop the keys on Daryl's head. Physics will only tell me if you drop them, then they will accelerate towards his head. Now I can come in with philosophy and say, okay, it is an undesirable outcome to have the keys fall on Daryl's head, so I'm not going to do it. All that physics has told me is if A, then B. If you let go, they will hit him in the head. So economics is the same way. Whenever you have an economic discussion with somebody, it invariably ends up with politics and philosophy. But economics itself cannot tell you what you should or should not do. Economics can only tell you if you do A, then B will happen. So it's always important to ask what the goal is. So a simple question that one of my economics teachers used to ask us is, which is better, a gas or a liquid? Depends on what what are you using it for? So when I breathe, I like my oxygen in the form of a gas. But when I drink, I like my water in the form of a liquid. So you may be thinking, this is really simple, right? Yeah, but in all those cases, before we can answer which is better, we need to know what the goal is. So the next question he would ask us is, which is better, communism or capitalism? For what? Well, I'm gonna take issue with that also, but that's the right way of thinking. What is the outcome that you want?
Well,
Go ahead.
I'll just say like define it like individually, then I could tell you which one is better for me.
Okay, well, again, you're thinking in the right direction. For what? For what goal? So if your goal is to maximize the wealth of a country, history has shown us pretty well that capitalism is going to do a lot better job than communism at making a country rich, making the average citizen rich, making the average wealth rich. But what about a family? Imagine running a family on capitalist lines. So little Susie is 3 and little Johnny is 5, and they need to go out and work so that they can earn money for food. And then poor little Susie's only 3 years old, so she's got just enough for food, but she doesn't have enough to buy a goodnight kiss for mommy and dad. That sounds like a pretty awful way to run a family. Families, in fact, are much better run on communist lines. Parents have all the resources, parents make all the decisions, and they dish out resources to the kids.
Dictatorship.
What's that say?
That's the dictatorship.
Yeah, a family is in many ways a mini dictatorship. And what is a family? What is education? But it's the preparation of a completely dependent little being into an independent being. And then once the being is independent, then that being can make decisions for itself. And that's what adulthood is all about. But the point in all of this is that we need to make sure that we look at what the goal is. So as we speak throughout the class, we've got to remember that economics is a positive science. Now, we will dabble in this class occasionally in ethical questions. But as we'll see, and I think Charlie pointed out, there's an example of balancing income versus balancing integrity in the textbook. What the economist is going to tell you is not, okay, this is what the goal of the company should be. The economist is going to tell you, if you set up this incentive structure, here's the likely outcome. If you want a different outcome, here's the incentive structure you should set up. This may seem super basic and obvious, I hope it does, but it's the kind of thing we need to remember as we go on throughout the class, because we're going to be talking about all sorts of situations, and we're going to use the tools of economics on a positive basis to try to predict behavior and to try to channel behavior. But the goals themselves are going to be independently set up. Okay, point number 6, planning and spontaneous order. Planning and spontaneous order. So what we find in the world is that there are a lot of things that are planned and a lot of things that happen without anybody being in charge. So let me give you one example. It is physically impossible for the 8 or so people who are in this room to go through that door at the same time.
No, on top of that.
Well, okay.
Okay.
If you want to get technical about this, let's imagine we've got a class full of 60 students. You cannot get 60 students through a door. So imagine there are 60 students in this room, and at the end of the lecture, I say, okay, everybody please stay seated. I'm going to open the door. First row, you're welcome to go out. Hold on a second, no. Second row now. That would be ridiculous. And yet, you're going to get 60 people out a door, physically impossible for them to do it all at the same time. Yet they're all going to get out within a matter of a minute or two without any fights breaking out and without anybody being in charge. That's an example of spontaneous order. Spontaneous order is order that happens without anybody being in charge. Language is an example of spontaneous order. Nobody sat down one day and say, you know, here we are in England, we've got Norse influences from the Vikings, and we've got these Saxon influences. Let's sit down and write the English language. No. Instead, what happened is the English language evolved from the interactions of different people and evolved over time as people find a way to communicate. Students will often ask me how long the US dollar will be the international reserve currency. So how long will it be? And can we replace it? I said, well, it's not a question of tomorrow we decide that something else is going to be used. It's, people are going to keep using the US dollar as long as it makes sense for them to use the US dollar. It's not going to be replaced by the Chinese yuan anytime soon because the Chinese economy is not strong enough, because China doesn't have a developed rule of law and a developed judicial system to handle the kinds of commercial disputes that go with having a currency. Nobody is in charge of saying what the currency is going to be. You could. The United Nations tomorrow could say, okay, we're no longer using the US dollar, it's going to be euros now. Nobody would listen. People would continue doing what they're doing. Now, it's quite possible that there will come a time when the US dollar is no longer the reserve currency because enough people have shifted to something else. That's a case of a spontaneous order. Probably not. But your challenge then, as managers, and we're going to talk about this more with knowledge next week, your challenge as manager or CEO is going to be to try to find the right locus of authority, the right place for authority. There are some things where it makes more sense just to let things happen because you don't have enough knowledge to do things better. There are other cases where it makes more sense for you to be in charge because you've got the big picture. And I'm just going to mention that for now. We're going to look at the details. We don't know in every case, and the challenge is going to be in every case trying to figure out who should be in charge. Should it be the line worker? Should it be the manager? Should it be the CEO? That's one of the big challenges that we're going to have in this class, but we're all trained to think in terms of order and planning. A lot of things happen without anybody being in charge. So the question is, when does it make sense to let that spontaneous order take place? When does it make sense to have control, and who should be in control? Tonight is just the introduction. The idea is that we're going to come back to it. We're going to talk about knowledge.
Isn't that kind of the same as marginal thinking though?
In what? Well, you can apply in what way?
Because you're saying, so I guess I kind of gathered from all that in deciding whether or not there should be dual order in certain circumstances, you have to like weigh as the cost of the, and that's kind of what you're saying, marginal thinking.
Yeah, one way to look at it is what is the marginal benefit versus the marginal cost of imposing more order. That's another way of looking at it, yeah. So you can decide, okay, I'm the CEO, my sales team is not doing as well as it could be. What can I do? What's the marginal benefit of giving them direction versus the marginal benefit versus the marginal cost? On the other hand, maybe what I can do is set up a different incentive structure instead of giving them orders. So that's, in all those cases, it's marginal thinking, specifically applied in this case to where the locus of control should be. Yeah. Okay. And if you're thinking about if you're thinking marginally, if you're thinking about opportunity cost, you already won half the battle. Now, the details. Are there any questions on this segment before we continue? Okay, no questions from my mind. So it's currently 7:22. Let's take about a 7-minute break, and then we'll come back and finish the last hour of the class. So I'm going to pause the recording. We're going to reconvene at 7:30 for those of you who are online, and then we'll finish up with that with the lecture. Okay, welcome back. So we're going to experiment with something different, and I apologize for those of you online, my huge face on this screen. I hope it's not too awful if it's traumatic. We're going to try a bunch of different things here, and I want to repeat that homework numbers 1 through 5 are due on the 9th of October, and homework 6 through 9 are due on the 6th of November. We'll have an online announcement to that effect, but I just wanted to mention that. Also, within the next few days, I'll have my notes. There's no PowerPoint for tonight. I'll have my notes posted for the last 2 lectures on the Canvas site, so we're working on that. And I've mentioned this a few times before. I thank you for your patience as we continue with this. There's a number of growing pains. I'm looking at you from over the screen here, a number of growing pains. So we're going to try this. The advantage of having the camera for the room is I can run around and gesticulate, and I think it's better for a conversation. I'm going to be drawing a few things on the board now, and so I'm going to zoom in on that, and I'm going to try to step out, and occasionally you may hear my voice without seeing my face, but that's probably better anyway. That's that note. I've got a face made for radio. You have a question?
What is gesticulate?
Gesticulate means making huge gestures with my hands. So good on you for asking.
it took me until graduate school, in fact, you're in graduate school, to be confident asking questions. And I thought, oh, I'm the only one who doesn't know that. Well, if I don't know it, I'm going to ask. That's why you're here, for education. And you will use words I don't know, and I'll ask you what you mean. So that works out nicely. Big gestures, running around. Okay, so yes, homeworks 1 through 5 are due on the 9th of October, and homework 6 through 9 are due on the 6th of November. Next week, there is no class. Labor Day, the university is closed. So you can spend time preparing economics or whatever your opportunity cost dictates that you should do. Yes, ma'am?
Okay, I understand that homework 1 through 5 are due October 9th. So like, let's say homework 1, does that pertain to this chapter that we're working on right now?
Homework 1 will be on the first chapter, 2 on chapter 2, 3 on chapter 3, etc. So we have, again, the growing pains I mentioned. They should be, the homework should be posted within the next day or two, since we're trying to coordinate with 2 professors,
All right.
trying to get everything done. Coordination costs. Okay, good. So what we're going to do now is a bit of utility analysis. Those of you who love the math part, Vitaly, I apologize, because this is not going to be a mathematically rigorous part. Simply because I don't think that's necessary for the purposes in this class. Should you take, if I ever teach intermediate, I don't know why you would take undergraduate intermediate micro, but hypothetically, if there's a PhD program in economics here someday and I teach microeconomics, there will be math, we'll have calculus for the analysis. We'll use, you probably love these, Vitaly, right? Lagrange and constrained multipliers. It's a multivariable calculus thing. And it's so awesome and so cool that we're not going to use it for this class. I'm kind of weird. You guys probably figured out I'm weird a little bit. I don't use mathematics in economics. I use history, I use philosophy, I use sociology, I use law, I use comparative institutions. And it's not because I don't like math. I actually like math. I think math is fun. I taught myself calculus when I was 13. So I found a book and I decided I was going to read it, and I loved it. And then after I taught myself calculus, I took pre-calculus. And the teacher gave us problems. I said, oh, why don't we just use calculus? It would be so much easier. The teacher said, no, we haven't done calculus yet. You've got to do it this way. And I didn't really like the class. So there's a place for mathematics in economics. There's an important place for mathematics. Those of you who are interested can take econometrics, which is economic statistics. Calculus has some powerful tools, and I'll give hints of that when we study supply. But my philosophy on this is what I'm trying to do here is not to make you mathematicians. If you want to do extra math on your own, you're welcome to do that. The purpose here is to give you basic tools for analysis. So I'm going to draw a couple graphs on the board here tonight. I'm not going to try to be super rigorous in these. We're not going to go through the detailed calculations. The idea is to give you a framework to think about how to apply economics to choice. So what we're studying now is utility analysis. Utility is just a fancy way of saying what people like. And choice involves 2 things. As in so many other cases in this, like a business firm has to think about internally, what's its production? See, I'm gesticulating again. Internally, what's its production? And externally, what does the market look like? Well, same thing as an individual. You face 2 things. You face whatever your preference is and whatever the opportunity is. So you can have a preference, like, I want to buy a Ferrari, but I don't have the budget to buy one, so that's kind of irrelevant. So I've got the preference, but I don't have the budget that's available. Likewise, I could go to the grocery store tonight and buy a box of olives. I don't like olives. So I have the opportunity, I have the budget, but I'm not going to buy it. So when we study the choices that people make, we're going to look at first the constraints that they have, which is called the budget constraint. And then we're going to look at their preferences and how they make trade-offs between different things. And that's what's called indifference analysis, because they're indifferent between 2 bundles of goods, otherwise known as utility analysis. So we're going to start with the budget. And a budget constraint simply means that you're on a budget, just like a budget, but it doesn't have to be financial. So every day when you wake up, you've got a budget constraint of 24 hours. If you have 5 people and you've got 10 jobs that need to be done, this may sound familiar to some of you because people always seem to be short-staffed. That's a budget constraint also. People are your resource and you're constrained, so you're going to have to make a decision. How are you going to allocate your people? Or a budget constraint could be money. If I've got $100, I can't spend $200. I can just spend $50 on books and $50 on wine. I can spend $100 on books and no money on wine. I can spend $100 on wine and no money on books.
Yay.
Just, yeah, there you go. Well, actually, I'm an economist. Yeah, so the two things that make economists work are caffeine and books. So, by the way, I should tell you, I might use a couple of weird examples in this class. My students typically think that I'm a drug dealer because I mentioned incentives, and I'm not a drug dealer. I just want to let you know. I do like wine and I do like books. And there are a couple of things I do, but just because I mention something in class doesn't mean I necessarily do it. I'm just trying to use examples to get you thinking of these things.
Our accounting teacher spent 15 minutes talking about the 3 books he wrote trying to get us to buy them.
That's okay. That's funny. Okay, so we're going to start with the budget constraint and an analysis of the budget constraint. And this is just another way of looking at the fact that we live in a world of scarcity. So your budget constraint simply says you're going to have to make choices on how to allocate your budget. So as I said, $100, you could spend $100 on one thing and no money on the other. So $100 on books and 0 on wine, or 0 on books and 100 on wine, or some combination, but that combination can never exceed $100. So the way we're going to graph this is simply if we've got 2 goods, we could call it books and wine. How's that look online? I'm going to try the blue. I'm going to try the blue marker also to see if it's better. Books is light. Okay. So let's say for the sake of argument that a book costs $10 and a bottle of wine costs $10. I'm too old to drink $10 wine, but that's another story. Let's not think about that. There you go. So that means that I could either buy 10 books, 10 times 10 is 100, right? So I could buy 10 books and no wine. Or at the other extreme, and I don't have graph paper up here, obviously, so I'm going to try to make it about the other. What's that, sorry?
10 wine.
10 wine and no books. So I don't know very much, but I'm really happy, or I know a lot and I'm sad. And I'm going to draw a line between the two of them. And that line represents the collection of combinations that we can have. So I could spend all my money on books and none on wine, but if I decide, if I'm up here and I've got 10 books and no wine and I want to buy wine, I'm going to have to get fewer books because I don't have enough money to buy them all. So maybe at the middle, one of the points could be 50 and 50, or 5 and 5, sorry. It's $50. So let's see how awful that is. 5 and 5. Or I could be somewhere here, say 8 and 2, just as long as the total adds up to my budget. And that budget constraint is the limit of what I can spend. So take an example of 2 points, a point here, point A, and a point here, point B. What's wrong with point B? It's outside of the budget line, which means that point B is going to represent a combination that I cannot afford. Point B is over the limit. It's above the budget. So anything to the, basically to the right, the textbook is going to call it northeast as if you were looking at a map, but anything above the budget curve, you cannot buy because you don't have enough money. That's like saying, okay, I've got $100 and I'm going to go out and spend $110. Can't do that. Now, what's wrong with point A? You're not getting the most for your money. Point A is like saying I got 6 books, I got 6 bottles of wine and 2 books, then you still have $20 left over in your pocket. Now, in this simplified world, you only have 2 goods that you can buy. So any point that's below the budget curve is inefficient, and any point that's above is unattainable. So that's why the budget line is going to represent your choices. That's your budget constraint on how you can spend your money. So you could make it a little bit more complex. You could decide, you could change the prices. That's going to change the slope. How much could you buy? And you could think about how much the relative prices are, but that's the basic idea of what the constraint looks like. Now, the two scenarios that we can think of, what if I go out and work more and I get more money?
Then you can increase your budget.
Changes everything. Suddenly I've got more money. So let's say instead of having a $100 budget, I'm now moving to $200. Well, that's going to shift my budget constraint out because I can buy twice as much of anything, and that's going to bring me up to 20 or 20. So that's simply going to mean that I can draw a new budget line here, and that's my budget line, budget constraint. If I have $200, and this is where economics is all about common sense, if I got $200, I can buy more wine and more books, and my whole opportunity has expanded.
And now the XP is below.
Boom. Suddenly I can afford that point, but suddenly that point, not only can I afford it, but what? Go ahead.
It's below.
It's below my new constraint. I can buy more books and more wine. Life is good, right? So this is an example of how we can visually represent. I've got arrows here. I've got a lot going on here, but that's a visual representation of opportunity cost. You cannot be at a point that's outside the line. You're going to have to make a choice. So that's your budget constraint. That's half of what we need to know about. What can I afford? And then the second one is, what do I want? Maybe I really like wine and I hate reading. Maybe I love reading and I hate wine. Maybe there's some combination. Different people are going to have different preferences. And this is the whole thing. Remember I said economics is a subjective science. It takes preferences as given. So you might want to try to change people's preferences through marketing and advertising, let them know that they had a burning need that they didn't have before. Now, you didn't know this, but this is what you really need. That's what advertising and marketing does. But at the same time, what you have to do as a manager, as a CEO, as a marketing director, is try to figure out what people's preferences are and try to respond to them. So,
Situation also be part of constraint. They say, I love drinking, but I don't really like books. But I'm a student, so I have to get a book. Can that be part of the? Okay.
so the question was, can preferences change with circumstances? Yes. So let's say that you hate reading and you decide you're gonna sign up for a graduate class. Well, you're gonna have to spend some money on books whether you like it or not. Now, that presumes that you have a preference for learning, otherwise you wouldn't be in the class. Just as maybe you never make your bed and then you go to boot camp, suddenly you better believe you're gonna have a preference for making your bed. So those are the kinds of examples right there. Good. So the second thing we need to think about then is, okay, what are the constraints? Now what choices are we gonna make within those constraints? And that is where we are looking at indifference curves. They're known as, I'm going to try with the blue here. An indifference curve and a utility curve are the same thing. So it's called a utility curve because it represents the utility or the satisfaction that you have, but it's also called an indifference curve because it shows the combinations of goods between which you're indifferent. That means that you don't care whether you get one or the other. So it might be that you can have, say, I'm just trying to think of an example here. You're equally happy if you've got 8 books and 2 bottles of wine as you are if you've got 8 bottles of wine and 2 books. But you wouldn't be as happy if you had 8 books and only 1 bottle of wine. That's not enough. You would need 2 bottles of wine as part of that combination. So the utility curve that I'm about to draw is going to show the combination of points amongst which you, the consumer, are indifferent. So you're equally as happy anywhere on this curve because those represent all the possible combinations. So I'm going to draw a random indifference curve, and I'm going to call it pizza and beer. By the way, a pedagogical exercise, is it cruel of me to talk about food at 8 o'clock at night if you haven't had a chance to have dinner?
You think?
Or should I just talk about the choice you have between books and opera CDs? No, let's
It would be fine if the example was like cook carrots.
Yeah.
Then I wouldn't care.
So we could have carrots and broccoli, right? Okay. So this is an indifference curve. Indifference curves can look different, but they're basically going to share a set of four different characteristics. The first one is there can be multiple indifference curves. So why is that? Every point on this curve represents a point where I'm equally happy. That is, if I've got a lot of pizza and a little bit of beer, I'm just as happy as if I have a lot of beer and a little bit of pizza, but I'm going to need to have a lot of beer to compensate me for the fact that I don't have much pizza. I would also be even happier if I could have more of both. And if suddenly the pizza, half the pizza and half the beer are taken away, there's still going to be a set of points that are going to make me equally happy within that combination of fewer pizzas and fewer beers. So the first thing is that there are multiple indifference curves. People will always prefer to be in a higher indifference curve. But if they're on a lower one, they're equally happy with any combination within that lower one. The second point is, I'm going to erase this and draw it again to illustrate. The indifference curves are going to slope to the right because of trade-offs. So let's say I'm at this point and I'm really happy. In order to be equally happy with less pizza, I'm going to have to be compensated with more beer. Sorry, what's that?
I think you give up and then you gain.
You give up and then you gain, exactly. So the arrows that I have here indicate that if I give up some pizza, a movement downward along the curve, I'm going to have to be compensated to be equally as happy with more beer. So a downward movement is associated with a movement to the right, which means that the entire curve is going to be downward sloping. The third thing to keep in mind with indifference curves is that they are convex to the origin. That basically means that they're C-shaped like this. Now, a little bit of mathematics here, but really nothing much. You notice that the slope of the indifference curves is changing. It is not a straight line. So let me try to see how this works with a color marker. Right here, we've got a pretty steep slope. Right here, we've got a flat slope to the indifference curves. So instead of being a straight line, the indifference curve starts really steep and then it gradually gets flatter and flatter and flatter, a little bit like a slide. And this is because of the law of marginal returns and specifically diminishing marginal returns. Why is that? If I'm over here in this corner and I've got a lot of pizza and somebody offers me some beer, I've got so much pizza that I'm willing to give up a fair amount of pizza in exchange for a little bit of beer. But as I get more and more beer and less pizza, it's going to take more and more beer to compensate me for my loss of pizza. So that means that we've got a lot that's represented by a high vertical distance compared to a low horizontal distance, in other words, a steep slope. And eventually that slope is going to get flatter and flatter as an indication that I'm going to need more and more and more beer as a compensation for the pizza. Remember the slope, rise over run. The run is getting bigger and bigger to represent the more beer that I need. And the rise is getting smaller and smaller, representing the fact that just for giving up a little bit of pizza, I'm going to want a lot of beer in exchange. So that's the third thing to think about with indifference curves. Now you can look at this mathematically, et cetera. It's the marginal utilities changing. But just the way to think about it in the simplest terms is that as I get more and more of something, the utility at the margin for the next unit diminishes. So I was talking to you earlier about donuts or chocolates or beer, whatever it is. Going from the 0th donut to the first donut is amazing. Going from the 7th donut to the 8th donut, not so much. So the marginal utility of the first donut is huge. My marginal happiness from eating my first donut is big. Then it gets smaller and smaller, and eventually it might get negative because I might get sick. So this is represented here also. The marginal utility is going to be diminishing as we get more and more of a good. And then the final thing is indifference curves can't cross, because if they did cross, we would be in an absurd situation because you have two conflicting bundles of goods. So that's the basic thing to keep in mind with indifference curves. And I'm going to draw two specific cases and then ask if there are any questions. Socks, perfect complements. I'm not going to be really happy with, okay, let's assume that these are fitted socks, right? Or let's use shoes, that might be a better example. A left shoe and a right shoe. If you've got a left shoe and a right shoe, how happy are you going to be if somebody says, well, what if I give you 4 left shoes and 1 right shoe? That's not really helpful. Because they are perfect complements, they're only going to be useful if you have the exact same quantity of both. So perfect complements, like this, complements are going to have a perpendicular indifference curve where you're going to have the same quantity of both to be happy, because you're not really any better off if you have 17 left shoes but only 1 right shoe. You're going to want 1 left and 1 right, 2 left and 2 right, 3 left and 3 right. The other case is perfect substitutes, which are going to be a straight line. So in this case, somebody's going to yell at me, which is for fun. Coke and Pepsi, which we all know are not perfect substitutes, but this is a good example for the class. Let's say you really don't care. To you, Coke and Pepsi taste the same. So you're really not going to care, and you're not going to have changing marginal utility. So the line's going to be the exact same one. You're perfectly happy to swap out 1 Coke for 1 Pepsi. If you've got 9 Cokes and 1 Pepsi, and they're the same to you, you're equally as happy as with 8 and 2. You do not have that changing marginal utility in the case of perfect substitutes. Now, who in this room honestly truly believes that Coke and Pepsi are perfect substitutes? I really didn't think so. As a quick aside, who prefers Pepsi? Do you have a strong preference for Pepsi? And who prefers Coke? And do you have a strong preference for Coke?
Yes.
Is anybody kind of indifferent between the two? Okay, that's rare, but I'm happy to know that. So most people have very, very strong preferences. It's either all Coke all the time or all Pepsi all the time. Matt loves Coca-Cola, thank you. But you can think of perfect substitutes. What are actually, let's pause for a second. What examples can you think of perfect substitutes? Things that you're completely indifferent.
Oh, Dasani water and another water.
Dasani water and another water. Water's water.
No.
Ah,
Oh, food, drink.
do they have different tastes? You know?
Yes.
Okay.
Dasani is clean.
Okay.
I hate Aquafina. And this is more
Yeah.
has aftertaste. And I love Boston more just because of the Boston.
I am told, go ahead.
Well, it depends. After meal, I like, like sparkling.
Yeah.
And then just whatever I like.
Okay. So what lesson are we drawing here? It doesn't really matter what kind of water you like or don't like. Tastes are subjective. Different people are going to operate differently. And this is one of the things, if you're in marketing, keep in mind that different people are going to react differently. For some people, whoa, you got to have the right kind of water. Other people really don't care. But that's going to be a subjective preference. Some people are willing to pay a lot more for things because they like them a lot more. Other people really don't care and just throw something at them and they're fine.
Are we also drawing on the conclusion that very few things are actually different?
Well, yeah, it depends for whom. Now, there's a difference between individuals and overall. So I would imagine for the country as a whole, Coke and Pepsi are kind of indifferent. They're kind of perfect substitutes. But if you ask any one individual, people are going to have a very strong preference. But overall, it's tricky. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Because again, we're not going to get into this tonight. But what you're pointing out is the important part is signaling. So if you drink the right kind of beer, so for the longest time, people were trying to signal that they were sophisticated by drinking better beer, for example. And then hipsters come along, and what do hipsters like to drink? PBR, which used to be a really cheap beer, but now it's sophisticated because the hipsters like to drink it. Okay, so that's kind of preferences change over time, exactly. Yeah, so if you want to get in the nitty gritty, it's going to be really difficult to get perfect substitutes. But so if you're in a restaurant, for example, this is just an example. If you're in a restaurant and you order a Pepsi and the waiter says Coke, will you still get the Coke? Yeah. Now, Coke, folks. So the other day I was in a restaurant, I ordered a Coke, and the waitress said, "Is Pepsi okay?" And I said, "No, I'll just have a glass of water or an iced tea." Because, yeah. Yeah, so we have 2 Mountain Dew fans in the class. This is good. There's another one here online. So it really depends on the preference. So for example, preferences changing over time. I used to drink 2 or 3 Cokes a day until I decided I was going to get back in shape. Now I have one Coke every month. I'm not wasting those calories on Pepsi. Whoa.
Yeah, that's I was raised on Coke.
Yep.
Hey, at least you're not dying. I'm drinking Diet Coke. I'll probably be dead next.
Oh, because of that.
Yeah. Be positive, right? Okay, so moving on, the next thing I want to do is let's put these 2 things together. We now know what the budget constraint is, and we now know what the utility function is. So we're going to put the 2 together. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to start by remembering. I'm going to put it up here in the corner, small, so 2 goods, X and Y. Let's call them that for now. Remember, there are multiple indifference curves, right? So if your budget increases, if you could have more of both, you'd be even happier. But within any indifference curve, you really don't, within any indifference curve, you really don't care where you are on that indifference curve, but you would be happiest if you could be on a higher one. I'm just putting that up there as a reminder. So if we have then our budget constraint here, let's use the typical example of food and clothing. Your budget constraint is here. This represents what you can do. Those are your opportunities. Let's start at 10 and 10, just for the sake of argument. Well, you're going to try to be on the highest possible indifference curve. And so if you're in an indifference curve that falls underneath the budget constraint, you're being inefficient. If you're in an indifference curve that is above the budget constraint, well, you're not really there because you can't be there. So you're going to be at the highest indifference curve possible that is going to touch the budget constraint. And that's an indication that you are spending what you can at your highest level of satisfaction. And technically what we're looking at is the point of tangency, where it is tangent, where the indifference curve touches the budget constraint.
You're gonna put this up, right?
Oh yeah. The book's got a good explanation. What I'm trying to do is to synthesize the basics of it all.
Yeah.
Because at the point of tangency, the slope of the budget is equal to the slope of the utility curve, or the indifference curve. In other words, your cost is just equal to your willingness to substitute, because the cost is going to be the budget curve, the slope of the utility curve. At that very point right there, at the point of tangency, the 2 slopes are going to be equal, but only at that point.
I mean, the slope is an action though, so it's like doing something, right? So when just where the lines touch, because the slopes of the lines are.
Well, okay, so the slope of the budget curve, that's the easy one to see, right?
Yeah.
So it's just what the relationship is between the drop and the movement to the right. At that point of tangency, that same slope, so remember any indifference curve is going to have a steep slope up here, yeah, and a shallow slope there. At the point of tangency, the 2 slopes are going to be equal. Okay. That make sense?
Yeah, just hard to see when it's been
So,
straight.
so the point of tangency is going to be the highest point that you can obtain while also maximizing your satisfaction. So let me continue with that and then come back to that if you've got it. The point of tangency, so the point where they touch, is going to be the highest satisfaction that you can obtain.
You need it without going. over
Yeah.
the budget.
So that's what I'm going to draw next. So I'm going to erase a few other things and now, if we were, so let's call this indifference curve, let's call it U1, because that's a good name for it, right? Economists are so creative. What is the problem with U2? At any point on the slope U2, you're indifferent between any points on those slopes. But what is the problem with U2?
Touches twice.
Yeah, about 10.
Well, it's not so much that it touches twice, but it's not efficient. You could be at a higher level of satisfaction. So you're not using all your resources. You're wasting, yeah. The problem, what if we're up here, U3? You'd be even happier if you could, but you can't reach that because it's beyond your budget constraints.
Go back.
Yep. So U3 is still there. Hypothetically, and we'll see in a second, if you get a pay raise or if you have a higher budget, you could reach U3. And that is your higher satisfaction, and you're cool with that. But given this budget constraint, you cannot reach U3. So the budget constraint is going to tell you your limits, and then the utility curve is going to tell you how you can maximize your satisfaction within that. So we're going to look here at another example. What happens if your salary increases? Well, if your salary increases, your budget constraint increases. So, oops, that was supposed to be tangent right there. So you might be able to obtain 20 and 20 max. Let me redraw this. I'll tell you a horror story in a second. If your budget were to increase, you could reach a higher utility curve, in which case you're going to consume more, and you're going to consume at this higher point because you're now able to reach that higher point. So there's not going to be a huge amount of graphing in this class, but I had a graduate math class, and all but 2 of my professors in graduate school were amazing. But the math professor would get up there and he would start writing equations on the board and mumble. And he would write another line and mumble. And then around line 6, he would realize that he made a mistake in line 2. So he would go back up and with his finger erase some of the things and write different subscripts in, and then do that for the entire 6 lines, and then kind of look at us, and then start over again with the next problem. So if ever the graphs are not clear, I apologize for that. Just let me know, and I will regraph them because I don't want to be that. Again, the book is a lot more precise. That's the idea. They've got the printing press and all that. I just want to show you some of the basic details. So this is what happens if you've got an increase in the income. But you could also have a situation where you have a change in the relative price. So let's say that you start originally at 10 and 10 with books and wine. And let's say that wine suddenly becomes cheaper. So instead of costing $10 a bottle, wine goes from $10 a bottle to $5. Well, that's, yeah, $2 chuck, right? That means that you can now obtain $20, 20 bottles of wine, which means that your budget constraint is going to shift outward. You can still buy 10 books and spend your entire salary on 10 books and not drink any wine, or you can buy twice as much wine. Well, that's also going to have an effect because you are now able to consume a bigger bundle thanks to that lower price. That's supposed to be a 2, so let me write that again. Thanks to that lower price.
The same, but
With the same budget, just because it's cheaper, so you're now able to consume more. So we could go into a lot more detail on that. We could look into things, and then when I put my notes up, I'll have a few extra technical things that I don't want to cover in class tonight. You could use calculus. There's a really neat trick called Lagrangian constraint maximization, where you take the equation of the budget line as your constraint, and then you use the partial differentiation to find what the point of maximum satisfaction is. We're not going to do that in this class. I just want to give you a general flavor. And I want to close with 2 examples. Let's say my budget is $200, and I have the choice between buying fine wine at $100 per bottle or Taylor Swift concert tickets at $100 per ticket. So my budget constraint looks like this. What do you think my actual choice is going to be based on my utility?
One line.
We're going to have what's called a corner solution. And I'm going to buy only wine and no, this is called a corner solution, where even though you could buy some of both, and my utility is going to be such that I will not give up any wine for a Taylor Swift concert ticket.
Oh, you meant you personally?
Me personally.
Oh, that's a trick
Wenzel's utility.
question.
Again, remember I say this is preferences. Some people might say, oh, I vastly prefer Taylor Swift tickets. But just as an example here, this is called a corner solution. So I want to draw your attention to application 2.8 in the textbook, the Merrill Lynch application. I'll let you look at that because I want to wrap up with the assumptions of economics. But the important thing, so please look at that for next class. The important thing to think about there is two things. First of all, how incentive structures can change behavior rather than wishful thinking, and the fact that honesty and integrity still have a price. And then the second thing to think about there is how these tools can be applied and how an incentive structure could actually backfire if people are paid too much on compensation. So I want to just take a look at that and see how utility analysis can affect choices that people have. And based on that, we can, if you have any questions, we'll talk about it next time. But I want to finish here with the assumptions of economics. So are there any questions on utility before I move on, either from the folks online or from anybody here in the room?
How are they quantifying utility in things like ethics, Maryland? That's what's like, it's really hard.
Okay, so you the question was, how do you quantify utility in terms of ethics? So there are two answers to that. The main one is these are the limitations. It is very difficult to say that you place a utility of 4 on ethics, but a utility of 6 on money. That doesn't really make any sense. On the other hand, we can observe your actions. We can observe the actions of a stock trader, and we can see that people do indeed get satisfaction. So these graphs are helpful because they can tell us, even if they're not precise, even if you could quibble with the exact shape of the curve and say, okay, well, okay, how are you really quantifying that? How are you really putting a number on it? The concept in general still applies, that people value integrity and they value money. And then you have choices, and this is what economists call demonstrated preferences. So good, I'm able to sneak this in. Demonstrated preferences. Economists are kind of harsh to the extent that economists will look at you and say, yeah, I know you're saying you prefer that, but your actions say otherwise. So if you've got somebody who makes a choice, for example, and let's say the choice between working in a bank or working as a professor. This is about as dressed up as I get. Unless there's a reception somewhere, this is about as dressed up as I get. I can whine all I want about how professors don't get paid enough and blah, 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 blah. But an economist is going to say to me, yeah, if money is more important to you than research, if money is more important to you than teaching, if money is more important to you than being able to dress casually, why don't you just go work for a bank? The fact that you're working as a professor tells me that that is your demonstrated preference. So people will have a demonstrated preference and they might say, oh, I'm always honest. But then they might sneak food into movie theaters. And then they might go see a second movie. So I might tell you, for example, I don't sneak food into movie theaters because I think it's a violation of the contract and it's a violation of property rights. The movie theater owner has sold me a ticket with certain conditions saying you're welcome to come into my movie theater to watch a movie, but part of that means that I'm allowed to tell you what you are allowed and not allowed to bring into my movie theater in terms of food. Fine, I'm cool with that. I won't do it. So back to the question, how do you quantify it? It's really hard to put an actual number on it. But You can still use utility analysis. So if you look at that, the case in the textbook, if there is more of the compensation that comes from a base salary, that's going to mean that there's going to be less of an incentive to pursue money from the compensation structure, from the bonus structure, and therefore less of a temptation to engage in bad behavior. So the framework can tell us some useful lessons. And again, this is the way I'm teaching this. Instead of spending an hour and a half or 2 hours working out math problems on the board, I want to spend a few moments graphing and say, okay, how can we apply this? And if you think about it, the same thing, what if you were, and this is the Enron, the typical Enron situation, where bonuses were going crazy, but there was no punishment structure on the other side for making bad decisions. So even if you can't quite put a technical number to express the satisfaction of the utility, the framework is still extremely helpful for looking at how people behave and how they're going to make their decisions. Good question. So that's a question about the use of mathematics and economics. Numerical examples can be good if you're looking at a data set, if you're looking at 10 years worth of sales in different departments, et cetera, that's great. If you're looking at, one study you might want to do is look at investment banks and look at how many investment banks had workers who were engaged in fraud and how many investment banks had workers who gave bad decisions to pad the numbers, as in Merrill Lynch. And then you have, as part of your data set, what percentage of the income came from bonuses and what percentage of the income came from base salary. And if you have that, then you can decide, oh, look, well, there's a correlation here, even if you can't really put a number on honesty. So that's where mathematics can come in. So thank you for asking that. Okay, so we're going to move on now. I'm going to look at 4 assumptions of economics. Now, students will always fight me on these, but it's kind of fun. We had a physics lesson earlier, and Daryl almost didn't enjoy his physics lesson, right? What do I know if I drop the keys, they're going to accelerate at 32 feet per second squared? But that's not the end of the story, right? Because there's air friction. So the shape of 2 objects is going to, the piece of paper is going to flutter downwards. An airplane is not immediately going to fall to the ground because it's going to have a glide ratio because of the difference in pressure between the air above and below the wings. But even if I know nothing at all about air friction, if I know nothing about friction, I know nothing about air pressure, I know nothing about temperature, the law of gravity still gives me a pretty decent idea of how objects respond. Well, in economics, same thing, we're going to have a bunch of simplifying assumptions. And that doesn't mean that economics doesn't explain the world. It's just like physics. You can still understand physics pretty well, even if you don't understand air friction and pressure and temperature. Now, if you want to build a plane, you're going to want to get a little more sophisticated. The same thing applies to economics. The basic principles of economics are such that even if you simplify the world, you're still going to be able to make sense of it. Later on, you can adjust those assumptions as you get more advanced in your study of economics, but that doesn't mean that if you simplify the world, it makes no sense. So the 4 assumptions that we've got are rationality. I'm going to write them down and then talk about them. The second is utility maximization. The third is 0 transaction cost. And I'll explain all these in a second. And the fourth is full and free information. Okay. So the first one is rationality. Economists assume that people are rational. That is, people calculate, they look at the world, and they look at the options that they have in front of them, they weigh the marginal benefit and the marginal cost, and they make their decisions accordingly to maximize their happiness. That's the first assumption that economists have. Now, you might argue, well, wait a minute, people aren't rational at all. People have time preference problems. Has it ever happened to you maybe that you set your alarm clock for 5:30 in the morning to go run 5 miles, and then when 5:30 in the morning rolls around, you decide,
No thanks.
I'll sleep an extra half hour? Well, which part is being rational? The part of you that wants to get in shape and run a marathon, or the part of you that slaps the snooze button? So there's a conflict between the two there, right? Likewise, people tend not to save enough and go in debt. It seems to be irrational. So there's a whole segment of economics known as behavioral economics where you can study the rationality of people. But there's also a weasel way out of that. Economists could sometimes say, well, rationality simply means that you're doing the best calculation that you can make to try to advance your happiness in that situation. So I'm being rational when I set my alarm, and I'm also being rational with the new information when I snooze. Now, parenthetically, what's one way I could get over that? I could put the alarm clock on the other side of the room. Get up. Have you heard of these phone apps where there's a small puzzle and the alarm will not stop ringing unless you solve the small puzzle? You see that? Or?
No, I don't.
Okay. So to prevent people from making that kind of decision. So one thing that we can talk about a little bit later in this class is how to frame things. One example of that is an opt-in versus an opt-out decision. So you get a new job. Imagine a situation where your boss says, if you fill out this form, we'll put 6% of your income into a retirement plan. Alternatively, the boss could say, we're taking 6% out to put it into a retirement plan unless you fill out a form to tell us not to. It's the same thing, but it's not the same thing because you're trying to guide people's behavior if you're worried that they might not be rational. So we're going to talk about framing a little bit later on throughout the class. And you can do the same thing with your employees if you want to get your employees to save. How can you nudge them in a particular direction? That, of course, raises the question of who knows best. But rationality is our first assumption. The second one is people maximize their utility. That seems to be pretty straightforward. Now, people may make bad decisions in terms of long-term versus short-term. I had a really fun summer, got a little out of shape. I'm going to get back into running steadily. So I was maximizing that kind of utility over the summer rather than trying to get in shape. That's one example there. But it gets tricky with the business firm. The assumption in economics is that the only motivation of the business firm is to maximize profit. And that's an easy way of doing things. But if you look at the real world, some businesses exist for reasons other than maximizing profit. You might want to put a computer on everybody's desk. Great if you make money, but you want to serve humanity. You may get up every morning and go work in a lab and try to find a cure for cancer. And you don't want to be a millionaire. You want to make the world a better place. And the textbook outlines 4 models or 5 models of what motivates people. And as you'll see, one of them is the money-only model. People are motivated only by money. Well, people are very motivated by money, but it's not the only thing. They're also motivated by happiness. They're also motivated by a sense of being a good citizen and contributing. Maybe people are just hopeless and they're just bad people. I really don't like that environment-only model because I think people respond to incentives. I tend to think if given a chance, people are probably going to be good, but they've got to face the right incentives. So one of the things to think about as a manager is what motivates your employees? What's going to make them happy? Is it simply going to be more money? Is it going to be a combination of salary and benefits? Is it going to be workplace conditions? What's going to make your people happy? So yes, utility maximization, but what utility? And the second lesson I want to draw about the utility maximization is what is called methodological symmetry. I'll explain that. Methodological symmetry. That simply means that to be a good economist, a good observer of the world, you have to apply the same rules to people. Example, it's often, and this is where economists like to get themselves in trouble. If you take a political science class, you might learn, for example, that business people are greedy, but politicians serve the common good. So even think about the language that is used. Public service, right, or a public servant, as opposed to a business that's working for profit. Well, the economist is going to come along and say, well, hold on. People are people, and they respond to incentives. So what I'm really interested in as an economist is what kind of incentive structure people face, because I observe the world and I see that some business people do wonderful things and they're honest, and others do awful things and they're dishonest. And you see that there are some politicians who really seem to be trying to serve the common good and the good of the country, and some politicians are trying to rack up their own profit. So instead of just having this blanket statement, everybody in politics is a public servant, everybody in business is greedy and selfish, the economist is going to come along and say you have to apply symmetry. That is, the same rules. So the symmetry might say people are utility maximizers and they respond to incentives. So what incentives are going to produce good business people and what incentives are going to produce good politicians? And we'll come back to that later when we look at regulation, for example, business regulation. You can't just say, oh, well, the government's putting in regulations in place that protect people. Well, maybe. But let me give you a quick example before we jump on. In the state of Louisiana, it is illegal to sell flowers if you are not a registered florist. And to become a registered florist, you have to pay money, you have to take a class, you have to pass a written exam, and you have to put together 2 floral arrangements that are judged by people who are already registered florists. So that doesn't seem like how many people die every year because of bad flower arrangements? There's a conflict of interest. So in that case, you might say, well, wait a minute, that's not a law to protect the public good. Last example, then I'll move on to zero transaction cost. The average training time in the US, I could be off by a little bit, the average training time for a paramedic is 400 hours. The average training time for a barber is 1,600 hours. Now, wouldn't you want your paramedic to be better trained than the person who cuts your hair? But what the barbers are trying to do is keep the competition out by raising the barriers to entry, whereas paramedics aren't making a huge amount of money. In fact, they would like to have more paramedics. So, number 3, zero transaction cost. A transaction cost is a cost that is necessary for an economic activity to take place, but that's not taken into account in the price. So, for example, you might have a $5 Coke here, or a $1 Coke at the grocery store, which is a 20-minute drive away. So the $1 Coke is obviously cheaper, but you've got to drive 20 minutes to get there. I had that example in graduate school when I didn't have internet at home. This was back in the dark ages where a lot of people didn't have internet at home. I had a cyber cafe across the street from me where I think it was $10 an hour to get internet, or I could go to the office where it was free. Now the office was a 30-minute drive. And when I got to the office, the department secretary would always say hello to me, and she would ask me if I wanted to take her daughter out on a date. So then I either had to avoid her or say no. It was always complicated. So just getting to the office was an hour drive, plus the time it took to talk to this lovely woman and explain to her why I didn't want to take her daughter out for dinner. So I would generally just cross the street and pay the $10 as opposed to getting the free internet because the transaction cost involved was too complicated. Now, economists will assume away transaction costs for basic decisions. It's just a lot simpler. You look at the price, people respond to price, that's it. Now, in the real world, we all know that there is such a thing as transaction cost. In fact, institutional design is one big way to look at how to reduce transaction costs. How do you reduce the transaction cost within a company? How do you reduce the cost of getting things done, reduce the bureaucracy, increase the efficiency? Finally, economists assume, as a very basic assumption, that economic actors have full information and that information is free. Now, we all know that's not the case, but as a simplifying assumption, it's helpful because then you don't need to worry about that. So if a consumer wants to buy a good, you assume that the consumer knows everything about the good. In reality, we all know that information is not free. You have to go out and get it. You have to research. You talked earlier about researching a car. We talked about search theory. People will search until the point where the marginal benefit is no longer greater than the marginal cost, then they stop searching. New technologies, the internet is huge for this. No, I don't know, you guys, the things you have, this is where I feel. When I went to college, we didn't have the internet, and we didn't have cell phones. So you had to go to a phone, you go to a public phone. I will always carry quarters with me and make phone calls. But I'm just thinking now how easy life is. So I got to Fayetteville, 2 weeks ago. I haven't gotten lost. Well, I got lost once when I turned off the GPS to try to test myself. But you guys remember going to a new town and trying to get to work without a GPS and traffic jams? If there's a traffic jam, you just wait in the traffic jam. No, you punch in the GPS, you find an alternate route, boom, you're done. Research is the same thing. It's so easy. You just pop in, you go see what restaurant. You used to have to buy a guide, like Zagat's Guide to Restaurants in North Carolina. Yes?
And also like with the Waze app, it tells you what
Yep.
the police is, blah, blah. I mean, it's just.
Yep. So to repeat that comment, the Waze application will tell you about speed traps. It'll tell you about traffic patterns. Yep. So these are all ways in which more and more information, acquiring information is getting cheaper and cheaper. But it's still not free to acquire information. You still have to have a framework to assess it. And then the final thing, I'm going to skip over this. There's an interesting section in the textbook on risk aversion and information. So you don't know how successful you're going to be when you're in a new job. So some people are going to love the risk or be comfortable with the risk, and they'd rather have a high portion of their income based on the bonus. Other people just want a flat income. I don't care. I don't want to run the risk. And even if I exceed all expectations, I'll be perfectly satisfied with my paycheck. That's a question of risk aversion. And that's also going to be a question for you guys. What is your level of risk aversion? So when you go out after the MBA and go look for work, do you think you're going to be more comfortable working for somebody else on a given salary? And even if you do a fantastic job, you're stuck at that salary? Or would you rather be an entrepreneur and run the risk of having no income for a little while, or run the risk of getting super rich because you're working really hard and you're successful? That's going to be a preference of each individual. So with that in mind, that's what I've got for tonight. What I'm going to do is I'm going to post these notes, and I'm going to post a series of questions on them. As you go through your notes over the next 2 weeks and as you read, what I would encourage you again to do is bring any questions that you have to class. But also ask yourself, if you were writing a case study, or if you were writing a term paper, or if you were hired as a consultant, what kinds of questions would you ask? And what kinds of things would you want to think about in greater depth? So I'll mention this every week. We had a conversation with Vitaly about this earlier today. What the open book exam is going to look like. It's going to be really open-ended in terms of applying the tools of economics to real-life business problems and real-life situations. The best way you can prepare for it, aside from going over your lecture notes and reading the book, is to think to yourself, how could this be applied to a real-life situation? Or if I had to write a term paper, what would I write about? So one of the things that I'm going to be doing, for example, so I'm still getting settled in, and I thank you again for your patience. My movers are supposed to arrive on Wednesday this week to get everything in. As soon as I have access to a printer, I'm going to go back and I'm going to read some of the articles that are summarized in the textbook. So this textbook does a wonderful job of summarizing them. I want to go back and read them, and I want to go read additional case studies so I can have more questions for you, and I can continue thinking about this. You may not have time to read all the articles, but you may want to read an article here or there that's listed in the footnotes. You may want to look at a case study. You may want to write up a half a page, just jot down a couple notes of, oh, I remember when I had a really nice boss who made a stupid decision. Here's how he could have made a better decision using the tools of economics. So, are there any questions from the online folks before we wrap up for tonight? Within the next few days, hopefully I'll have my own email. And I thank you for that contact. And then what I'll do is I'll be in touch. Office hours are one way to reach me. Email is going to be another way to reach me. I don't think there's anything urgent at this point, but I thank you all for your attention. And once again, I thank you for the patience. There's still some growing pains on this, but I'm already having a lot of fun, so I thank you for that. Yes, the recording will be available. I'll have it posted probably within 24 hours. All right. Enjoy Labor Day. Be safe, have fun, and maximize your utility based on your constraints.